the decision that nearly ended the office. There are decisions that test the presidency, and then there are decisions that threaten the presidency itself. This was one of the latter, a moment when a single choice risked unraveling the authority of the office in ways no one could fully control. The pressure leading up to it was relentless. Institutions were strained. Public trust was already fragile. The margin for error had vanished completely, eroded by months of accumulated tension and unresolved disputes. Every option carried consequences, but one choice stood apart. Not because it was bold, but because it was irreversible. To understand why this decision nearly ended the office, we have to understand how presidential authority survives. It depends on continuity, on the belief that the office will endure beyond any one leader, that some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed without damaging the institution itself. This decision hovered over one of those lines, the kind of line that exists not in law, but in institutional memory, a boundary maintained by the shared understanding that crossing it would change the nature of the office permanently, regardless of whether the immediate outcome was positive or negative. Advisors warned of precedent. Legal experts cautioned restraint. Political allies urged caution. But the situation felt extraordinary. Time was short. Waiting risked escalation. Acting risked something far worse. The perception that the presidency had abandoned its own limits. The president faced a brutal calculation: preserve the office by doing nothing, or act decisively and risk changing it forever. In that moment, survival and destruction felt dangerously close. Because if the decision succeeded, it might save the nation, but weaken the presidency. And if it failed, it could strip the office of legitimacy in an instant. This wasn't about policy. It was about whether the presidency itself could survive the choice it was about to make. And once that decision was set in motion, there would be no quiet way back. The hours after the decision were defined by silence. Not relief, not celebration. Silence. Inside the White House, no one spoke confidently about what would come next. Every screen was watched, every report reread. Every outcome felt provisional. The president had crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. At first, the system held. Orders were followed. Institutions responded. The immediate danger appeared contained. From the outside, it looked like leadership had prevailed under pressure. But beneath the surface, stress fractures spread. The decision, regardless of its immediate outcome, had altered the landscape of expectations surrounding the office. What had been assumed to be fixed boundaries were now understood to be flexible under sufficient pressure, and that understanding could not be reversed. Legal questions surfaced quietly. Political allies began recalculating distance. Opponents prepared narratives that framed the decision not as necessity, but as overreach. The presidency had acted, and in doing so, invited scrutiny it could not control. This is the cost of decisions that test the office itself. Even success becomes unstable. Every future move was now interpreted through the lens of that choice. Was the presidency still bound by restraint, or had it revealed a willingness to go further than ever before? Institutions began protecting themselves. Compliance continued, but cautiously. Support came with conditions. Silence replaced enthusiasm. The visible markers of institutional support remained, but the energy and conviction behind them had been replaced by a cautious calculation of self-interest. The office had not collapsed, but it had been shaken. And once the presidency is shaken, it must spend more time defending its legitimacy than exercising its authority. The decision hadn't ended the office, but it had placed it in jeopardy. And what followed would determine whether that risk would fade or define everything that came after. As days turned into weeks, the presidency entered unfamiliar territory. The decision had worked, but only narrowly. And narrow success is dangerous, because it leaves no margin for error the next time. Every institution began recalibrating around the possibility that the office had changed. Not legally, not formally, but psychologically. The idea that there were lines even a president would not cross had been shaken. Inside the White House, this realization weighed heavily. Authority was still intact, but legitimacy now required constant reinforcement. Each action had to signal restraint. Each statement had to reassure skeptics that the decision was exceptional, not expandable. But repetition undermines reassurance. Each explanation reinforced the awareness that something unusual had occurred. The more the presidency sought to frame the decision as exceptional, the more it reminded every observer that the boundary between normal and exceptional had been demonstrated to be movable. The more often the presidency explained itself, the more it reminded the system that explanation was now necessary. Power that must justify itself has already lost something essential. Opposition voices sharpened. Allies hedged. Courts watched closely. The office was no longer operating in open space. It was navigating under permanent scrutiny. This is how near-ending decisions reshape institutions, not by destroying them, but by narrowing their room to move. The decision created a precedent that constrained future action, even as it enabled the present one. Every subsequent exercise of authority would be evaluated not only on its own merits, but in relation to the boundary that had been crossed, making bold action simultaneously more possible and more suspect. The presidency could no longer act first and explain later. Every move risked reopening the question of legitimacy. Every crisis carried a memory of how close the office had come to breaking its own foundation. The decision had saved the moment, but it had endangered the future. And now, the presidency had to prove, day by day, that it could still be trusted to hold itself together. In the end, the office survived, but it survived altered. The decision that nearly ended the presidency never fully faded from view. It became a reference point, a warning, a shadow that followed every future exercise of power. The presidency regained stability, but not innocence. Every action was now measured against what had almost happened. Every expansion of authority was questioned sooner. Every emergency decision carried the weight of that moment. This is the paradox of near disaster. The office endured because the decision worked. But because it worked, it also proved how fragile the boundary truly was. What once felt unbreakable was revealed as negotiable under pressure. History would later debate whether the president had any real alternative. Some would argue the choice was unavoidable. Others would insist it was reckless. But the deeper truth is simpler. The presidency itself was changed by confronting its own limits. Power did not collapse, but it learned how close it came. And once an institution understands how near it was to ending itself, it governs differently, more cautiously, more defensively, more aware that legitimacy is not permanent, it is maintained. That is the lasting consequence of the decision that nearly ended the office. Not failure, but fear of repeating how close everything came to falling apart. That fear became a permanent feature of the office, shaping how future presidents would approach decisions that test the boundaries of their authority. The memory of near ending does not fade with time. It becomes part of the institutional character of the presidency itself. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The decision